Hey, listeners, and welcome to the first Red News Special Topics podcast, where we will be covering special topics in relation to the entertainment industry. Today, I'm here with Texas Tech University Professor Bobby Schweizer and Professor Megan Condis, and we're going to be talking about toxicity in the video game industry, primarily what's going on with crunch culture right now, or what has been going on with crunch culture, but what's being brought to light recently. So let's get started. So what do you guys know about crunch culture in the industry? Just in general.
It's your office
Sucks.
going to start?
Yeah. Quote me. So when I think about crunch, I think about when you have like a deadline that a creative team like really wants to meet. Like, we really want a second city in our giant RPG game, and we're willing to put in like the overtime to make it happen. And then management will interpret that as it takes 3 weeks to make a major city in an RPG because that's how long it took them, without acknowledging that they were working 80 hours a week because they really wanted to make it happen, and it was 3 weeks till release or whatever. It seems like crunch culture is like the slow accumulation of circumstances like that then transforms into an expectation that making video games always involves lots of overtime, lots of last-minute work, because that's the experience that people remember having on past projects, and that's become the amount of time now that higher-ups will budget for things is based on these kind of emergency sessions as opposed to quote-unquote regular working conditions.
Yeah, because when I think about the crunch culture, it's pervaded the industry for so long that it's hard to say like this was the company that started doing it to people, and maybe you're like in a small company, it's like 3 people that you're working with to make something, and you really have to like work extraordinarily hard. You're dedicated, but as Megan says, like, you care about that thing because it's your baby. That is like an exciting moment in your creative development.
Or like at Atari, it would be like one person off.
Yeah.
They're like, you one person go make Indiana Jones, the Atari adaptation. And yeah, like, you love Indiana Jones and you love your art that you're making alone somewhere, and so you're willing to put in the overtime. But then it becomes, oh, well, when we asked, I'm going to make up a name, we asked Jeff to make this game, it took him a month to do it. So that's about how long it takes to make a game, right? And, so some of it is like lack of communication between management and labor, and then some of it is also just banking on that love and that passion and saying, there's a million people who would love to have a job in the games industry, so if you're not willing to work 80 hours a week, we're going to take the next guy in line.
And this often comes out of particularly young people going into the industry who are looking for whatever job they can get. So the thing about QA at NetherRealm,
quality assurance,
was that these are people who are just like looking to break into the industry somehow, and they're in Chicago, and the Chicago game scene, there's not that many big companies there, so you got to take the opportunities when you can get them, and when people know that, then they're going to take advantage of your labor.
Okay. Did y'all hear about those people coming out about working on Mortal Kombat recently?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's pretty disheartening. But there's like a whole people having like PTSD, I guess, not only from seeing crazy things that they view to add to their games, but just like from working those 80 hours and stuff.
Yeah, like Mortal Kombat's story is like a double whammy because and there's been studies about this in other media too, so this is not unique to video games. Like, if you're making a police procedural TV show and your job is to make the realistic looking corpses for Law and Order or whatever, like, you're being exposed to that really negative content regularly, and that's not healthy for people. Content moderators for social media have the same problem.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a Facebook content moderator and the video of the Christchurch shooter goes up, like, you see that video 4,000 times a day during that like crazy period, which is crazy. And so that's a problem with Mortal Kombat. But then another problem just becomes lack of sleep and too much stress and sitting at your desk and forgetting that you've missed 2 meal times because you're working. Like, I think it would be unwise to look at the Mortal Kombat case and be like, look, it's just another example of violent video games are harming people. But, you know, a lot of the problems with that were related to the kinds of working practices that also exist on, like, The Sims and Candy Crush and, like, all sorts of games that have very benign content, but that the expectation is still that your family comes second and your leisure comes second and your health comes second, and finishing this thing by the time that the first quarter profits come out comes first.
Okay. So do you think the industry should unionize?
I think there are a lot of benefits to it, certainly. You know, it's a different kind of industry than some other industries that are more localized around a particular city, like the way that the different parts of Hollywood have unionized into, like, the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild and Actors Guild. So, you know, so much of that production takes place there, and people live there or headquarters are based out of there, but then they go and they film in Atlanta or Toronto or wherever. It's certainly worth trying to make things better and to see what works. 'Cause, you know, there's some pushback against the way that could limit other people getting into the industry, or the way that it could possibly create, you know, like new play or existing places, like making those like the dominant places where games get made, because that's where the people live that are working on that. But with the model that we have now, which is in a lot of cases supporting that at those bigger organizations, like people who are based in LA or San Francisco or Chicago or Austin, these big companies, and a lot of that talent already pooling there, then it certainly seems like this is an established solution in other industries that we should bring to video games.
It also seems like I know some of the pushback against unionization in games has to do with fears about, like, creative limitations that might get placed. So, like, well, what if I really want to work overtime because I really do want to add this feature before the game finally gets released? And are they going to, like, come in and be like, no, at 40 hours a week, I'm going to, like, turn off your computer and make it so you can't work anymore? And I guess my response to that would be, typically with unions, if there's more work to be done than there are union members, then the union goes out and gets more members. Like, unions could be a way to get more people involved in the industry, because it's going to mean that companies can't work their workers 80 hours a week, and so that means they need 2 40 hours a week workers to get the game done on the time frame. So either, I mean, I guess the fear is games could come out more slowly or could come out with fewer features because the union restricts that. I think what would probably happen is that, you know, game companies know what consumers demand and what consumers want in games, and they would have to make choices to make those things happen in more humane ways if the union was putting limitations on them. But I come, like, both my parents are union workers, so our household has only ever seen positive benefits from unions. I'm sure you could talk to people who've had negative experiences with unions.
And ideally, if, you know, a union is coming from the ground up, then the members of the union are setting the terms, and maybe they'll build in things that, you know, of ways of spending more time on these creative practices. Well, like the things that they are, like, enjoy about making games, while getting rid of all the things that are detrimental to their well-being.
Like, one thing would be make the crazy amounts of overtime paid overtime. Right. So much of crunch is unpaid overtime.
Yeah, when you're salaried and someone asks you to come in on weekends, what are you going to do? Not get fired? Like,
yeah. So, I mean, some of it might mean, you know, maybe it's still a very intense, you know, not friendly, like, maybe the industry itself doesn't change, maybe it's the compensation packages that change and that allow people to make more informed decisions about, do I want to commit 80 hours a week to this or not? Or maybe it's more like, you know, it seems like a lot of the Hollywood unions are like about hours and who's allowed to do what jobs, and maybe it's more bureaucratized like that. But it seems like the people who should be asking that are the developers who would be forming those unions.
So you mentioned how there's I guess a fear that games would come out slower, which is something I definitely could see happening. And also another potential drawback, I guess, could be the price of games going up, because already to get the full experience of the game, you have to pay $80 to get the season pass. So I guess
well, part of the structure of the industry right now is it's very top heavy and bottom heavy. So the big companies, the major publishers are making a significant bulk of the money. And if we get a Far Cry every 3 years instead of every 2 years, is that the worst thing in the world? Those releases, the pace of all those releases probably wouldn't be hurt to slow down a little bit. We may actually get better products when we're not so driven towards pleasing shareholders at these major publishers.
Yeah, imagine if Madden had to be substantially different every time it came out, because it comes out every 3 years instead of literally the same game with the numbers on the jerseys changed
right,
occasionally.
The game this week. And then the unionization wouldn't hurt people who want to just produce independent games for fun and for hobbies and to throw them onto itch.io. It's not going to change those practices where those people are self-motivated. So it's really the people who are being taken advantage of that need the protections.
I would also say that things like microtransactions or live services or ongoing engagement plans are profit models that require constant crunch. So it's one thing to crunch in order to release a game that's on a disc and then the people buy the game and the game is done. When you have a game that's constantly getting massive updates to include new areas or new events or whatever, now the crunch cycle is constant, and it's constant so that you can keep getting buy another $20 expansion or buy another $5 loot box or whatever. So if the thing that we don't like as consumers is this kind of constantly have to keep paying in order to incrementally buy the game step by step, then eliminating crunch is going to encourage people to just make a complete product and charge for it one time.
And I was thinking about the story that came out sort of comparing Fortnite and Apex Legends in terms of the push of content coming out of them, right? Fortnite has fast turnover, they're constantly iterating on the game, the new seasons, and that does require the kind of work that Megan is describing, whereas the folks from Apex were kind of you know what? We're working on our own schedule, we have a plan going forward, but we don't want to overwork people. And yet the consumers are out there why aren't you, this game has been out for a week, why hasn't it changed? Mm-hmm. It used to be this game is out for 3 years and it will either never change or wow, look, it changed once.
Yeah, Super Mario Brothers hasn't changed since 1983 or whatever.
The expectation that we have that games should be updated every 3 weeks is kind of absurd from a consumer standpoint.
Yeah. So, with the God of War, it's being praised right now, and they even came out a documentary about it. Mm-hmm. But I was reading that a lot of people were crunching hard for that game, and someone had mentioned that why is it receiving so much praise? They should be focusing on the crunch of it. But that's if you work so hard to develop this, you want it to receive praise, but it's kind of a double-edged sword almost.
Yeah, You definitely want people's hard work to be acknowledged, but you also don't want that hard work to then set the standard of now anything that isn't to this standard and at this pace, which I think that's those two things together, that's the killer, mm-hmm. right? At this standard, we can develop things to an amazing standard. At a fast pace, we can do that. Both together starts to become, if we demand this amazing content on such a regular output schedule, we are essentially saying we are okay sacrificing the lives of the people who made this thing. And in some ways, welcome to capitalism. We're happy to sacrifice Bangladeshi children so we can have shoes.
But they're not tweeting.
Maybe I shouldn't be.
True.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
They don't have a platform.
and all, you know, and also there's like, I think we value like creative workers, and we want to put like some game makers on like on pedestals and say like they are the, you know, artistic visionaries, or like the auteurs of Metal Gear Solid or of whatever, right? And so we kind of take seriously allowing those bright stars to perhaps burn out early. But what we need to remember is that it's also like the lowly QA person, or the like the person who's modeling poor Sonic the Hedgehog, like who's now going to have to go back and redo all of that, like
for a movie no one was going to see, regardless of what happens.
And so it's like, it's reminding ourselves that we are saying to those people, like, your health is a okay sacrifice for me to get my every year release of Far Cry or whatever.
On the IGN message boards, people were actually pretty much saying that and not seeing a problem with it. And I was just like, they're like, if you can't, like what you said earlier, like if you can't keep up with it, you shouldn't be in the industry. That's so toxic.
And it definitely privileges very young people. So like, if you are 22, your body can not like thrive, but can survive on like Red Bull and late nights for a while. But you get to a certain age and you can't, or you want to have a family and that doesn't happen.
It's like the turnover rate at Facebook for game development was so fast, because they would grab anybody who wanted a job out of college who had enough skill. And then, you know, you live on the campus basically, like you live in the building and you have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner there. And you go home and it's exciting for 2-3 years. And then... Like
you go home to a dorm on campus, right? Like it's college 2.0.
And you're taking a good job because you have student loans to pay. So like you're going to work it. And then, you know, want to settle down. You don't want to work those long hours. You have a family. You have other things that you need to do. And then suddenly you just get slowly pushed out the door by other people who have that, you know, initial drive.
And that's also bad for consumers, because that means if the workforce is constantly brand new, we're re-solving problems that have already been solved because the people who solved those problems retired at 26 because they couldn't handle it anymore. So maybe the problem of like content quality and pace would eventually resolve itself if you had like veterans who had been in the industry for 12, 14 years who could manage teams and say, oh, we've had this problem before, we know how to solve it. And so maybe like it's a different kind of efficiency. It's an efficiency based on knowledge and experience, as opposed to an efficiency just on pure like manpower hours and burning the candle at both ends.
And what do those people do when, you know, they graduate from college to go into game development, and then they do it for 5 or 6 years and they absolutely hate it after that? Like, what are they supposed to do after that?
Part of the job of a good game development school, if you're a school that specializes in getting people into the game industry, should be to prepare people for what the industry is actually like. And I think very few places do a good job at that, particularly the ones that are cranking out the most number of graduates. And in school, like, you get used to crunching, because, you know, in the same way you stay up late to write a paper for a class, you're going to stay up late that last night before your project is due to finish your game. And that just becomes a part of the cycle that's immediately ingrained into your production practices when, you know, you're 19 and 20. So of course it would make sense for you to go to a place that's doing that. So schools have a responsibility to let people know what's up.
Yeah, you do. And also to not like romanticize it. Like, I think there's some sense that like game development is pitched as a passion, and so if you're just in it for the money, or if you want to work a 9 to 5, then this isn't the job for you, and you're not tough enough to handle it, or you don't love it enough to do it. Frankly, academia is the same way. Like, when you're in grad school, they will tell you, like, if you're not willing to pick up and move, this is maybe not relevant to you, but I think it's an interesting comparison. Like, no one tells you when you first enter grad school, you're just going to live wherever the job is, and you might not be able to, you know, say goodbye to your sweet granny now because you're not going to be able to live near them anymore, or you're not going to be able to find a job in the same town as your partner or whatever. It's only like once you get deep enough into it that it's now difficult to pull back out and go on another career trajectory that you find that out, and then you're like, well, now I'm stuck. And I feel like a lot of creative fields are like that too, where they kind of get you in the door by saying like, games could be your job, this could be your passion, you're not even going to care about the money because you're going to just love going to work every day, and then surprise, 2 years down the line they're like, oh, also you're going to work 100 hours a week. Like in Red Dead Redemption 2, didn't they say some people working 100 hours a week?
Yeah.
I didn't even know there was 100 hours in a week.
So, you mentioned how this has been around for almost probably as long as gaming has, right? But for me, I remember, back in like high school, middle school, when all I would do is come home and like get on IGN on my desktop and be like, what Assassin's Creed 2 news, what Halo 3 news is out there right now? And I would see all these dev diaries, and those people, they seemed like they were having a good time and they loved what they were doing. And now, and even unrelated to this, I've been thinking like, how come I never see dev diaries anymore? Like as a journalist, like those are pretty cool things and I never see them anymore. Is it just because now everyone hates doing those jobs? Like,
I mean, my guess would be lots of NDAs.
Yeah.
You just can't talk about your work anymore.
You can't be like, I did Kratos' finishing move today, and it goes like this. Like,
right, like the package of the release of a game is so structured that even just like an animation is an announcement now. So, you don't have the opportunity to talk about that. Where you do see dev diaries is in hobby game creators. They're the people who are posting, hashtag screenshot Saturdays.
And like I figured out how to make it do the thing I was trying to make it do.
Right.
Yeah.
Go on to itch.io and read the diaries there of people who are busting on a game for fun.
Okay.
That's probably where most of the interesting stuff is happening anyway, because the other people are doing great works, but they have less autonomy. So they may discover something cool. You may hear about like, I remember hearing a story about the way that the water was animated in the opening scene from Uncharted 3, like on the tanker. You're like, that's amazing, but like, that's the one person who has a lot of autonomy or a lot of like control over the way that thing is going to happen. But yeah, I figured out how to make this neat thing happen, or like look at this weird glitch that I'm turning into a game. That's the fun stuff.
I've seen that on Tumblr. Like someone was building a Golden Girls game. Have y'all seen that?
Oh my god!
No.
Hold on a minute. Tumblr.
I apologize. I have to run. I have another meeting.
That's okay. And now that Bobby's gone, Professor Condis and I are back talking about why all of this is now coming to light. Now, Dr. Condis, what were you saying?
People are just now like, well, not now, but within the last 5 years are talking to each other and comparing notes more, whereas maybe people used to think, this is just bad luck at this company. We got time crunched, and so we all had to like pitch in for overtime. But once people start sharing stories and they start realizing, oh, that wasn't luck, that was built into the planning of game development, where they intentionally said, we're not going to allow enough time for this to unfold with 40-hour weeks. Towards the end, we're going to just plan to ramp up to 80-hour weeks. It's when people start comparing their stories from company to company that then they realize, oh, it wasn't just we all had to pitch in to do this one-time thing, that it's actually it is a culture and not just an accident. I think maybe that's some of the reason why people are more up in arms about it now than they were in the past. It's like there's been enough people who have moved from job to job thinking, well, I work at EA. Everyone knows EA is like the worst, voted the worst company ever, right? And then they move to another company and they're like, oh, they do crunch here too. Weird. I thought that was just bad management at my old job. And then they realized, no, this is like an industry thing.
One guy was saying, I work at, he didn't, they didn't name names or anything. Mm-hmm. I work at, what's supposed to be one of the best, places to work in the industry. And I'm so surprised that I'm dealing with crunch culture here too.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so best becomes relative, right? Like, that makes a lot of sense.
And so, getting a little away from crunch culture and just into kind of the whole toxicity of the industry, you've done research like on gender and stuff in games, and while games themselves are becoming so diverse, in the kind of characters that you're seeing. The industry is not where you'd hope it'd be.
Right.
You know, like most women, when they have a baby, they may not come back to work. Whereas there's like a stigma, if you're a man, you kind of have to return. And so
Right.
they kind of want to own up to that. But like,
Or even just if you're a woman, for one, in the video game industry, a lot of the women who work there end up getting put into more like front-facing positions. So like community management, where they're dealing with complaints or comments from the community, whereas men still tend to dominate the like programming oriented parts of the job. And some of that is like, you know, we can look even, you know, back down into like, well, let's look at computer science departments. Like, well, look at the gender balance there. Are there women who are making it through that? Let's look at junior high and high school science curriculums. Like, are girls getting encouraged to join the science club in high school or whatever? Like, so I don't think that's just a games problem. That's like a tech computing STEM problem,
or
right?
even like a world problem.
Yeah. But also I think one thing that's interesting with games is that the end results in the communities for games are getting a lot of attention. Like, how do we clean up toxic behavior in games where players are calling each other slurs and like, and yes, that's a thing that we definitely need to clean up. The culture at large. And so when you have stories in the news about like Riot Games and women employees there facing sexual harassment and staging a walkout, you know, then it starts to become, well, does this company actually value having like diverse participation, or do they just want to avoid the PR nightmare of being seen to be toxic, right?
Yeah.
And I know one thing that Riot has done, to give them credit, to try to solve this problem, is they hired a diversity officer whose job it is to, one, like, manage hiring decisions and make sure hiring decisions are fair and that people aren't, you know, overlooking qualified female candidates or queer candidates or people of color or whatever. But they're also there to listen to comments from people in the community who maybe feel marginalized, or to listen to employees who need to have someone that it's safe to talk to about the discrimination that they face within the company. And so, you know, maybe going back to unionization, that's another thing that, like, if employees are organizing, they can make these proposals to say, well, we want to make sure that we're creating spaces where non-majority representative employees still have a channel where they can be heard through, as opposed to like the one female employee in the meeting feeling like, am I gonna have to raise my hand and bring up sexual harassment in this meeting with me and 19 other white men? Like, I don't want to do that, right? But unions maybe could be the kind of way to direct some of those problems and to adjudicate some of those problems without having it to turn into lawsuits, or without having it turn into strikes and walkouts, because there'd be like a place where those grievances could be heard.
Okay. So do you think like it will have to come down to more like of a localized thing, because of how Bobby was saying how, like, you know, in Hollywood that's where most of those people are based, whereas the games industry there's people in Canada, America, Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Like how's that gonna work?
Yeah, I mean, and that's part of the interesting thing to think about is, so like, especially if you're comparing like games that are made in Korea, games that are made in Japan, like their like labor laws are different over there, their like work discrimination laws are different. And so, you know, it's not going to be like Hollywood is big enough that all the other movie industries just have to do it our way because we're the juggernaut. Like, it's going to be some kind of either localized, like the American game industry is going to be like a whole separate animal from other nations, or it's going to have to be some kind of like, this is a silly way to put it, but like the UN of games, where people are going to get together and say, like, as a global industry, we all need to agree upon, you know, rules that we're all going to share, that will work under the laws of all of our different nations, but are also going to protect all of our employees. And especially as China starts to get into, China right now is a big consumer of games. They're not as big in terms of production, but then again, they own Tencent, right? So they're definitely starting to become a player on that field, and getting them involved and not letting one country kind of drive and say, well, our labor standards are what everyone else is going to just have to put up with because we're doing it the cheapest or we have the biggest audience. You're going to have people getting together and agreeing and saying, like, Nintendo and BioWare and Tencent are all, all of their employees together are going to be held to the same standards and protected in the same ways. I think that'd be the ideal way to do it. That would probably require a lot of organizing on labor's part, and a lot of sacrifice, because that's going to mean not just jumping ship and saying, well, I'm trying to organize and enforce solidarity, but if this other company offers me a bigger salary, well, maybe I'll just move over there. Like, it would require what do I want to say? It would require a lot of communication across national boundaries, but it would also require a lot of kind of willingness to stick out the attempts by industry to buy people out or lure people away or threaten to just fire everyone and bring in scab workers or whatever it happens to be.
It's hard to get a bunch of people to agree and to get together on anything, honestly. But there may be potential for the industry because it's, I would argue, one of the most largely connected industries because of the internet.
Right.
We're all able to communicate with each other.
Yeah, it's not like, I work in a Toyota factory in, Detroit. Or maybe that's a bad, Toyota wouldn't be in Detroit, right? A Ford factory in Detroit. And it's like, well, how do I know what's going on in the Ford factory in Flint, Michigan? I don't know. Unless I drive over there or meet someone. But yeah, right now the reason that crunch culture is being talked about is because devs are going to Twitter and telling their personal stories and collecting their stories. And yeah, I think that tool and the fact that their job takes place on the internet, that is their factory, is online. It makes the communication part easier. It's the when it comes down to, they told me that I could crunch and keep my job, or I could protest and get fired. People have mouths to feed and they have rent to pay. That's hard.
Yeah. Cool. I don't have any more questions.
No, well, I could chat about it forever, and I'm going to look up this Golden Girls for sure. I'm excited about it.
It is one of the dumbest things, but also it's cool, and someone's probably just sitting on their desktop putting it together.
Well, it's even if you aren't into it, it's just someone loves this so much and spent so much time just rendering in pixel art the little characters. I don't know. I think that's something that you can appreciate even if it's not your cup of tea. Is just someone was so proud when they finished this, and that makes me happy for them.
And that about wraps up today's cast. Listeners, thanks for tuning in, and remember to keep it here at Red News for all your movie, video game, and comic news. Catch you next time.